Go girl, give us nothing.
Don't tell my mom about this.
You know how she gets.
Yeah, no, of course I won't.
Sometimes it scares me how good of a liar you are.
Put your ring back on, honey tits. You haven't had enough porridge this morning to talk like that.
Hi, I'm Lady Genevieve, and on my channel I talk about entertainment media. Today I'm going to be reviewing Regretting You to complete the coverage I already did of the film's source material. If you're not new here, you will already know this, but just in case you are new, I will explain that for the last year or so, I've started adding source material videos to my regular output of film reviews. Occasionally, I will also review television on here, but film is my primary medium, and film at the cinema in particular. What I will do is read the source material, do a video introducing that, share some early thoughts about how one might go about adapting that film, the casting that's been announced thus far, whatever I feel like sharing at that early stage, and then once the film is released in cinemas, I will go and review that both as a film in its own right, but also talk about it as an adaptation. Regretting You is an adaptation of the book of the same name by author Colleen Hoover, which I read and published a video on earlier this year. I did not buy the book. I got it from the library. Every book I've read this year has either been checked out from the library so I can read a physical copy, or I will check out an ebook if that's all that's immediately available to me. Also, through my library card. Libraries are the best. If you don't already have one, you should definitely get a library card from your local library, because even if you don't use it very often, by simply taking that first step of getting that library card, you will be helping that library with its funding. So my review pull quote is as follows. Despite competent performances from its lead, Regretting You is an adaptation devoid of imagination or a distinct vision to elevate the story for the film medium. Every artistic choice lacks style and fundamentally fails to justify a theatrical release. Before the film even began, one of the trailers that played was for Reminders of Him, which is the next Colleen Hoover film adaptation, which I have already published a source material video on. That film stars Micah Monroe and Tyreek Withers as the lead couple, and I have to say, I did correctly speculate that they would release that trailer just in time to be able to play it at the cinemas before Regretting You. I had gotten an email earlier on in the week announcing the promotional release of that trailer, and I said to myself, yes, just as I expected. Regretting You tells the story of Morgan Grant and her teenage daughter Clara, both of whom embark on love stories following the death of Morgan's husband Chris, who is Clara's father, and Morgan's sister Jenny, who is Clara's aunt, and was having an affair with Chris for an unspecified but presumably significant number of years. Morgan's love interest is Jonah, whom she has known since they were teenagers, and Clara's love interest is named Miller, whom she knows from her school. If you would like a more detailed explanation of the plot, you could just go and watch my source material video, because there is very little that has been changed from that into the film adaptation. Smaller details have been modified or consolidated in ways that make sense because films have more logistical issues to consider, things like runtime or other various variables that will come up in production. For example, when Clara and Miller have their first on-screen encounter in the film, she gets out of her car and ends up helping him to move the city limits sign, and in the book, her shoes get ruined because there was some road work happening. I think the roads were being repaved, so that sort of black goo had not settled yet, and it got all over her shoes. In the film, one of her shoes just breaks while she's helping Miller to move the sign. If you think about how much extra work it would be to create some sort of goo and set that up on a road that they're using to film on, that's a lot more of a hassle, especially if you're using a real road instead of a set that exists inside a studio where you don't have to worry about opening that road back up for people to drive on once you've finished filming. A change like that is one that makes sense, but it's also not going to fundamentally change the trajectory of the story and what's happening for these two characters and the relationship they're going to develop as the story continues on. The lack of changes from the book was the wrong choice. Even if a book or play is good on its own, it's very common and perfectly valid to make some modifications when you put that story on screen. I'm not making any claims about the exact type of changes that needed to happen in order for me to give it a positive review, because there are many options that could have worked, especially if I were to make comparisons to other adaptations that I've covered on my channel. For example, if I compare the Mickey 7 book to Mickey 17, the film adaptation, Mickey 17, had a lot more comedy and it was more romantic compared to its source material. However, it's not a fundamentally different story. The short story The Monkey, compared to its film adaptation, again, the film adaptation went for more of this darkly comedic delivery, even though the premise didn't fundamentally change. You have a spooky toy monkey that you need to watch out for, because if that toy goes off, someone will not be surviving long after. Even when you have a story like Regretting You, where there is a lot of death and tragedy, the monkey is a story with lots of death and tragedy, but you were still able to have fun with it and make the audience laugh. Why not consider injecting a dose of humor into the film adaptation and make it more accessible to viewers outside of the portion of viewers that have read the source material? Now, again, to be clear, I'm not saying that the only way for me to have enjoyed a film adaptation of Regretting You would be to inject humor. I'm merely using that as an example of one of the ways that you can reimagine a work of print to elevate and lift the material in its overall delivery on screen. One of the first things that jumped out at me, in a bad way, to be more specific, was that the film opens during a flashback to the adult characters when they were teenagers, and they attempt to de-age the actors using what amounts to blurry Facetune-esque VFX, and it looked absolutely terrible. It was so uncanny valley to look at and rendered any emotional investment of those scenes impossible. You are making a film for theatrical release. This will be presented to its audience on the big screen, where things like that are very visible and highly distracting. Why not just cast teenage actors to play those versions of the characters? It's beyond me. Even if they don't bear much of a resemblance, you should trust your audience well enough to follow the tried and true method of different actors playing the same characters at different ages in the same story. Dave Franco has the same face as Signore Mangione. You really think it's that difficult to find a late teens, early 20s actor with a South European face and strong eyebrows? Surely not. And that was just one example of a recurring problem throughout the film, where they consistently failed to visually elevate the film's presentation. When I published my source material video on this book, I had some feedback from viewers who seemed to feel as though this story didn't sound like it had enough in its pages to fill a feature film's runtime, or that the so-called dramatic narrative came across more like a Lifetime film or a direct-to-streaming film. And I didn't have as much of an opinion about those particular claims, because from my perspective, in regards to what it is that I do on YouTube with source material and the adaptations, I need to see the adaptation and any alterations that have been done in that process to see how my impression of the story will differ from its source material. I will talk more a bit about that in a moment, the visual thing, but I wanted to revisit the posters in Miller's room because I spent perhaps an unnecessarily long amount of time talking about them in my video on the film's trailer, but I like to see movie posters because they can tell me more about who you are. One of the details that I didn't really think as much about at the time, but it came more to my attention this time once I could see the film in its entirety, is that all of those movie posters are from Paramount Pictures. Regretting You is a Paramount Pictures film. The thing that actually tipped me off to this is that one of the posters that's shown in his room that I couldn't figure out when watching it through the trailer because only a small portion of it was showing ended up being for Novocaine, which is a film that was released earlier this year. And I had thought to myself, what an odd choice to include compared to a lot of these other films, the majority of which were older as opposed to a recent theatrical release. And then during one of the scenes at the cinema, because Miller works at an AMC, they showed a poster on the wall for The Running Man, which is another book-to-film adaptation. This one releases next month. By the way, I already have my source material video published on The Running Man, so if you would like to go ahead and watch that ahead of the film being released in just a couple of weeks from now, feel free to do that. So these two new movies just hit some sort of signal in my brain that made me go and cross-check, and sure enough, all of those movie posters were from Paramount Pictures. It certainly would make the licensing process easier to just keep everything in-house, but I still wanted to see something a bit more out of the box to what I would expect to see among the preferences of a young film bro. And what do you know? I spotted something in the film that was not visible to me in the trailer. Sunset Boulevard. Excuse me. Is young Miller Adams an appreciator of the great Billy Wilder? Excuse me, Some Like It Hot is on my wall. Some Like It Hot was the blueprint, a childhood favorite that all but guaranteed that I would someday become a White Chicks fan, because White Chicks is a hilarious reimagining of Some Like It Hot. I made an entire video about that years ago. Finally, though, we found something for me to give Miller a single nod of approval. But now I have to nitpick again because there's a poster behind him on his wall relative to how he was standing and framed in the bit that you were able to see in the trailer. But in a different scene in the film, you were able to see that that poster is for Pet Sematary, more specifically the first one. Now, is the first Pet Sematary more commercially and critically successful compared to its sequel? Yes, of course. However, why wouldn't you just do it for the bit and put Pet Sematary 2 on Miller's wall? Do you know who was in Pet Sematary 2? Clancy Brown, the actor who plays Miller's grandfather in this film. Do it for the bit. Most moviegoers are not going to hone in on that detail. You could have just done it for the film buffs in the audience who like to hone in on those sort of details. By the way, Pet Sematary 2, I've not seen that film in years, but I have some surprisingly vivid memories of it considering how long it's been since I last saw it, because I was so scared when I saw that film because of how terrifying Clancy Brown was in it. I was not at all acclimated to the horror genre when I saw that film, so I might have been a bit traumatized by the experience, which is probably why I have retained that in my memory the way that I have. Now, this detail could be regarded as frivolous, but I also think that it could be evidentiary support of my larger point, which is that this adaptation lacks imagination and creativity and artistic style. When McG did the first Charlie's Angels films, one of the things he did was he had a set built that recreated the bathroom from Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, and the majority of what ended up in that scene didn't even make it into the film's final cut, though you do see a bit more of it in the blooper montage in the credits. But this is what I mean. You need to be an artist. Let me see the passion and the inspirations that have shaped your creative process in your work. The casual moviegoers don't need to understand that, but the people who review films professionally or semi-professionally, people who engage with the film medium because it's a real passion of theirs, those are the people who are going to hype up your work, review it well upon its immediate release, let people know that they should go see it at the cinema and buy it on physical media if they missed that theatrical window. Now, those viewers are not the only ones who matter. Sometimes a film can get terrible reviews upon its initial release, but then other people will find the film and they love it, and it has legs. Exhibit A, COOL. Exhibit B, why do you do what you do to me, baby?
I also saw you have Josie and the Pussycats back there, which I fully support. You know,
iconic.
some real bangers in that movie as well.
But even in those examples, when the general audience is the one that is leading the way for the film to eventually gain this phenomenal legacy, those fans will go and dig up trivia. They will find things, do something specific, put something in the details for them to find. Now, circling back to my issue of this film being devoid of anything visually remarkable, across the board, there's just nothing interesting to look at. The way that the scenes are lit, shot composition, the way that the camera moves or doesn't move in the space of a scene. I felt like a child being raised in a beige household and in desperate need of something bright and vibrant to stimulate my brain into developing. For example, Morgan in the book, she's trying to figure out what she's going to do with her life now that she is a single parent because she was a stay-at-home mother. She dropped out of university because of her pregnancy and having a baby at a young age. It was just too much for her to handle at the time, and Chris ended up becoming enough of a provider that it was enough to be able to support their family. But now she is in her mid-30s and she needs to figure out what she would like to do. Should she go back to school? The film doesn't really explore that dimension of what would happen after a death like that, but they do a version of that by having her decide to remodel the house, because the house that they're living in is the house that Chris had grown up in. It's his family home. And in the film, she had some sort of aspirations for something that she wanted to do with, I don't know if it was interior design or architecture, but they showed it as a teenager. It was something like that. So the way that they give her something in the story to indicate that she is going to make her own life now and live the way she wants to, instead of just going along with how Chris has done things, she gets to work on remodeling the house. Technically speaking, is it a different decorative style after she's finished? Yes, but it was still such a bland, finished result. I was so uninspired and unmoved by the production design. Who did you make this movie for? Beige housewives? I'm pro-cinema. I will always prefer the cinema over the direct-to-streaming model. But you gave us absolutely nothing that makes use of the grand cinematic medium of playing your art on the big screen. What good are decent actors to play these characters when every other aspect of the story and the visual presentation are entirely bland and underwhelming? I don't have to love source material to rate a film adaptation well if you can make that film stand on its own merits. But this offered nothing of the sort. We've got The Running Man in November, The Housemaid in December, People We Meet on Vacation in January, Wuthering Heights in February, and Reminders of Him in March as some of the upcoming adaptations that I will be covering here on YouTube. I've already published source material videos on all of those that I just listed, and I sincerely hope that at least a few of those will be significantly better than this, because this just might be one of the most underwhelming adaptations I've reviewed here on YouTube in quite some time.